Hello everyone. Thank you for attending the Engaged and Effective Nonprofit Board training. My name is Lily, the Agency Training Coordinator for Arizona Food Bank Network. Today, we are very excited to have Jenny Carrillo speaking with us. Throughout her 30-year career in the nonprofit sector, Jenny has earned an outstanding reputation for planning and executing effective fundraising and organizational development strategies for a variety of organizations. So thank you, Jenny, for giving us your wisdom today. Just a few housekeeping rules. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat box. I will keep track of the questions and we'll either answer them at the end of the presentation, or if it's applicable to what Jenny is currently talking about, I'll just go ahead and be like, hey, Jenny, someone has a really quick question on this thing. Lastly, if everyone who is not speaking can please be on mute, that would really help and would be a courtesy to whoever is speaking. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Jenny.
Great. Lily, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today to talk a little bit about good board governance. I think I might have changed the name of my presentation in between sending you the description and finalizing it yesterday. Somehow talking to food banks made me think of ingredients. And so that's the current working title of today's workshop is Essential Ingredients of Good Board Governance. Lily mentioned that I've been working in the nonprofit sector for about 30 years, and all of that with much of it with very small organizations like your own. And so I definitely want this to be relevant to you, knowing that many of you are coming from small communities, rural communities, and very small boards and organizations. But the information that I'll be sharing today, much of it comes from a national resource called BoardSource. And BoardSource is considered the national authority and thought leader around all things related to nonprofit board service. And they have a number of really incredible resources available for free on their website. And some of it requires a paid membership. If you ever find yourself wanting something that requires paid membership to access, feel free to call me or email me. You'll have my contact information at the end of the presentation. I'm happy to download it and send it to you. So both my business partner, Laura Alexander, and I are certified through BoardSource as trainers and consultants to help share some of this information with you today. As Lily mentioned, I'd like to actively use the chat function if that's available to you. And in lieu of doing live introductions, we'll just have you go ahead and put your name, the organization you represent, and perhaps your role within that organization, whether you're a board member or a staff member or some other kind of volunteer. Go ahead and put that in the chat, and that way we'll have a little bit of a record of who's with us today, and you can maybe perhaps find each other more easily in the future. So today we're going to spend time talking about how effective boards function and some of the tools or techniques or best practices that you can put into place to help your board provide the best governance leadership to your organization. So right away, I'm just going to share we found in our work with organizations that there are really these 6 key ingredients for governance, if you will. And that if an organization is paying close attention to all of these things, then they're going to function at a much higher level. And so right away, being really clear about your mission and your purpose as an organization, having a really clear and concise and compelling mission acts as a compass or a North Star for your organization to say, to remind ourselves, why do we exist? And what are we working together to try to accomplish? And always making sure that your decisions are in line with that mission, that you're not veering off or straying too far from without being really intentional about that. So that clear focus on mission Today, we won't spend time today really talking about that. But leadership is one of these essential ingredients, and that will really be a focus of much of what we're talking about today. And when we talk about leadership, we're talking about the shared leadership between your chief executive, whoever that is, whether that's a paid position or not a paid position, whoever is functioning in your highest staff role. In a moment, we'll talk about the difference between management and governance, and the unique roles of doing the work, which is management, and guiding the work, which is governance. So in highly effective organizations, there's a real clear understanding of those two different roles, and a strong partnership and leadership between specifically the board chair and the director, but the board as a whole and your chief staff. We find that when organizations have a thoughtful strategic plan, which really is your roadmap to the future, if your mission is your purpose for existing, your strategic plan says this is where we're going. This is what we hope to accomplish in the future. Organizations that are guided by a strong strategic plan that helps chart that future course and the actions that you're going to take to get there, again, are generally higher functioning and more successful. Streamlined structure. So here we'll talk about this a little bit when we start talking about working in committees, is making sure that you're organized, your organization is organized in alignment with whatever your priorities are. So if you have priorities around fundraising, then you've got some kind of committee or working group around that. If you are focused on in-kind food donations, or if you're focused on fresh food acquisition, you may develop committees around those areas. And that structure, aligning your committees with your priorities, is another ingredient for success. And then finally, composition of your board and staff, right? Making sure you've got the right people in the right positions, focused on the same mission, is such a key thing. So really thinking intentionally, especially when it comes to board development. Who do we need to have involved with this organization to ensure that we're representing our community and that we have the skills and the expertise that we need? And then finally, board meetings. That the work of the board as a whole is only done when you are convened and in quorum. And so you want to make sure that you are using that precious time together effectively, efficiently, strategically, and that we're not making governance decisions outside of the boardroom. When 2 or 3 people might get together and chit chat and come up with something, an idea, and run with it. And then the rest of the board is saying, hey, what's going on? So we'll talk about the importance of planning for effective board meetings. So that's just a little kind of overview of what we think really healthy, high-functioning organizations should be paying attention to in terms of good governance. But I'm going to take it way back to the basics and throw a question out to this group, and that is, why do nonprofit organizations have boards in the first place? And feel free to unmute yourself if you want to speak up or share an answer. Why do you think nonprofit organizations have boards? Any thoughts about this? Crickets, right? Like, why wouldn't we just do it with just paid staff or volunteers? But why? What's the purpose of this board layer? Liz, did you have a thought?
Yes, this is Liz Thomas from Valley View Community Food Bank. My thought is that it's to have representation from the community you're serving, and input into that,
Very
so
good.
that you have a broader view of what you're really trying to do in addition to meeting the mission.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's definitely one of the benefits of boards, is having that broader. Oh, I think we might, unless Marilyn's gonna speak up, I'm gonna have you mute yourself. Just there was some background noise. Anyone else have thoughts? Terry, why do nonprofit organizations have boards?
Well, one, it provides some structure and it'll make you legally compliant with your 501c3. So, but it does provide
says we have to.
Yeah, and it does provide structure and guidance. So,
Right.
and it does give lend a little bit more towards the authoritative part of it.
Yeah, that's a valid benefit, or one of the reasons we have. Okay, thanks, Marilyn. Anyone else have thoughts about this before I tell you what I think? So nonprofits have boards because boards represent the community's ownership of the nonprofit organization. A nonprofit isn't owned by the executive director. A nonprofit's not owned by a founder. The nonprofit's not owned by the staff, right? The nonprofit is owned by the community, and the board represents the community. And so while you are serving on the board, you carry that responsibility. You represent the broader community's ownership, and then you pass that ownership on to another community member at some point. So I think it is really important for us to think about it this way, that the board represents the ownership of, but the board isn't necessarily the professional expertise. And again, I recognize that many of you are from smaller organizations who may or may not have paid staff. But this is where, when we start talking about the difference between governance and management, there's a difference between representing the ownership and doing the work, right? And so we'll talk about that unique balance, especially if you serve on the board and you're a volunteer, right? I'm guessing that many of you wear multiple hats. You might work in your food pantry or food bank. You might collect food. You may run food drives. But when you're doing that, you're acting as a volunteer, not as a board member. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So one thing I think is really important to acknowledge when talking to boards is that not every board is the same, and not every board or organization is in the same phase of its organizational life cycle. And it's very different to talk about, the old Concho food pantry than the community food bank of Southern Arizona, right? Which is a huge organization with 60, 70 paid staff members. So I just wanted, just for context, to give you a little bit of information about these 3 stages. We're really going to focus on stage 1 and stage 2. My guess is that most of you aren't in a stage 3 or institutional board, but you may recognize some of these characteristics of what we would consider an organizing or founding, or sometimes the term that we use is a working board. And by working board, I mean the board members are actually doing the work of the organization as opposed to just providing governance. So typically these stage 1 founding working boards are relatively small in size. They're probably relatively homogeneous, especially if you are led by a founder. Often these board members all have a personal connection to the founder of the organization, their friends or family. They all kind of come to support the vision of the founder. Board meetings are very informal and much more operational. We're spending much more time talking about, how many pounds of food and, who forgot to lock up the freezer, and those kinds of operational details tend to be very task oriented. And the reality is something we hear, especially if you do have a director, task oriented, but maybe not super reliable, right? Board members will agree to take on tasks, but often don't follow up. And then the leader, the executive director, ends up picking it up and doing it anyway and getting frustrated that they can't rely on volunteers, and it becomes this like vicious cycle. I'm sure that's not familiar with any of you, but we certainly hear that a lot. And again, this founding board doesn't really see themselves as having a fundraising role. They really see them there to make sure that the organization is just operating efficiently. And so organizations can stay in this stage one for decades. You know, we work with lots and lots of small organizations and in small communities, and frankly, this is just how it's going to be for them. And I think, you know, just recognizing that this is where you are in your organizational life cycle and who you are may help eliminate some of those frustrations. We typically see two types of boards in this stage one, and those are either organizations that follow the leader, or organizations that lead boards that lead or control the organization. And so sometimes there's tension there between perhaps a paid staff member whose job it is to manage the organization, and a board that is either very passive or a board that is perhaps micromanaging. So that's just something to be aware of and to recognize. And if you're interested in this whole concept of organizational life cycle, I can share much more information with you. The stage two, which is what I would say as organizations mature, what we're trying to move towards, is a governing board that's really shifting from operations to more governance, more policy, more future focus. And fiduciary oversight. A relationship begins to develop between the board and the staff, and we begin to understand and feel some of the tensions around sharing of power and authority. The board chair and the executive director emerge as leaders and sharing sort of maybe that public face of leadership to the community. So the director as the management leader and the board chair as the governance leader. The board tends to grow during this phase and perhaps become a little bit more diverse in terms of its composition. And we start to do more work at the committee level rather than hashing everything out in the board meetings. And there becomes a better understanding of the staff being accountable to the board, and the board understanding its responsibility for ensuring that the organization has the resources it needs and becoming a more active in fundraising and resource acquisition. And the reality is that the staff leader ends up in this phase investing quite a bit of time in developing a board that is useful and productive and supportive. So that's just two different frameworks. You may find yourself feeling, very solidly here in stage one. You may feel perhaps you're very solidly here in stage two. Chances are you're somewhere in flux. Boards are not static; they're very dynamic, and we're constantly trying to evolve and grow and change. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of roles and responsibilities and clarifying expectations, because we find that most of the time when you join a board, you're given very little information about what that actually entails. This is just common. I'll tell you, it happens, regardless of organization size and maturity. So the conversation, often just looks like this. You want to join our board? Great, yeah, sure. But most of us don't have formal training in board service. We don't really know what that means. We perhaps imagine that it's some kind of like super volunteer role. Like, oh, I'm just going to be like more engaged as a volunteer, but I'm going to have the ability to help make decisions. But really what we see is this disconnect, right? We're bringing somebody on the board. We've got one idea, oh, they're super connected in the community. I bet they'll raise lots of money for us. And the potential board member has a completely different idea of, oh, I think it would be so rewarding to, distribute food in our community, or to work in the garden, or to, again, be sort of this super volunteer. And so we have to have the conversation up front about what our expectations are for board service. And as board members, we have to communicate our expectations about how we want our time to be used, how we want our expertise to be applied, so that it is a satisfying and rewarding experience for us personally as board members, but it's also productive and useful for the board and the nonprofit organization itself. So tools like having a board member job description. It's a very simple thing, but if you can agree on what those expectations are around attending meetings and participating on a committee, and perhaps even volunteering, in your food pantry, or if there's a fundraising expectation, being really clear up front and not trying to, just sort of bait and switch. I think sometimes we think, we'll get them on our board and then they'll fall in love with us and then they'll just start giving us money or raising money for us. If we haven't been really clear about that up front, there's a really good chance we're going to be disappointed. So when we talk about roles and responsibilities, there's some widely recognized best practices. This comes from BoardSource. Excuse me. This comes from BoardSource. And BoardSource has broken out the responsibilities of nonprofit boards under these three broad umbrellas. The first being establishing organizational identity. So this comes back to the mission. It's really the job of the board to determine and advocate for the mission of the organization, and being super clear about what you do and what you don't do in terms of your mission. So I'm working with a food pantry in Safford, Arizona. And one of the things that their board is really grappling with right now, their current mission has them focused on Graham and Greenlee counties. But there are some Native Indigenous communities surrounding that area. They've started providing service to those communities. And there's a little bit of tension on the board right now. Is that within our mission or is that not within our mission? And only the board can make that decision. So determining and advocating for the mission and ensuring effective planning. It's the job of the board to work closely with staff to make sure we have some sense of where we're going and how we're going to get there, okay? And then the second umbrella is ensuring adequate resources. And this includes both human resources and financial resources. So it does include selecting the chief executive, the director, the executive director, whatever you might call it. In most organizations, that is a singular board responsibility. However, I understand that some of you your structure might be different. You might be a food pantry that's operating underneath a church or some other broader community organization. And so some of these rules may not apply to you, but I like to think it's good to know what the rules are first before we decide which ones we're going to break. So generally the board is selecting and supporting the executive director. They're ensuring that there's adequate financial resources. So helping to develop a budget that meets your objectives for the year. And if you don't have the financial resources, then maybe the objectives need to be scaled down. But making sure there's a prudent plan in place. And if that plan includes fundraising, generally, the board's role then includes actively participating and engaging in those fundraising activities. It's the board's job to build its own competence, right? To ensure that you have a plan in place for bringing on new board members, for developing those board members so that they can be effective in their role, and staying in touch with board members to make sure that they're feeling satisfied with their engagement as a volunteer in the organization. And then finally, adequate resources. It's protecting the reputation of your organization and enhancing the public standing. So that's being able to speak confidently about the work of the organization in the community, not undermining the organization. Even if there's some things going on that you disagree with, those disagreements happen in the boardroom, right? Privately, not out in the community where you're, disagreeing with maybe decisions or directions. That's not being a very good board member. Have those vigorous debates behind closed doors in the boardroom. So that's ensuring that you have adequate resources. You have a good reputation, you have the right leader, and you have the sufficient resources to meet your goals. And then finally, and this is probably the best understood of the areas, is providing oversight. So once you have perhaps hired a director, you want to provide adequate support and evaluation of that person, that chief executive. This doesn't mean micromanaging them. It means making sure that we have shared performance expectations, that the director knows what the board expects of them and is able to demonstrate that they can meet those expectations. It's not, I didn't like how they did that, or I think they should do it this way instead of that way, right? That's not the board's role to direct the director, but to evaluate the director. And that's a pretty important distinction. We need to make sure, it's the job of the board to make sure that our programs are relevant and effective and working. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean critiquing the programs, but rather evaluating them, or knowing that there's some mechanism in place to measure and count and report on how much food you're distributing, how many people are benefiting, are you in compliance with any grants or contracts that you have, and staying on top of that, right? That you know that the organization is doing what it says it's doing in the community. Finally, protecting the financial and capital and even human assets of the organization, making sure that you have good risk management policies in place, that you're paying attention to the financial state of the organization, that you're not going to be caught unaware if you're unable to meet payroll, or you're unable to meet your operating expenses. A good board member knows, right? We're really close to the margin, or we're in a good position right now. And then finally, the board has the legal responsibility of ensuring that you're complying with all local, state, and federal laws and regulations. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And so there is some amount of education that you need to have as a board member, so that you know, what are the requirements in Arizona for a nonprofit organization? What does the health department say we need to do to operate as a food pantry, to make sure that you're compliant with that? Because at the end of the day, you represent the ownership. You have the legal responsibility. So I'll pause here for a moment and see if there's any questions before I move on.
If anyone has questions, feel free to unmute yourself.
Or put it in the chat and we'll come back and address it. Okay, I'm going to keep plowing forward here. I want to be cognizant of our time. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you should know that board members actually do have legal responsibilities. In legal jargon, they're defined as the duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. Basically, duty of care says board members have to pay attention. You cannot claim ignorance as protection. So if you don't come to board meetings and you weren't looking at financial reports, or you never were receiving annual reports, you were negligent. You have to pay attention. Duty of loyalty says you have to avoid conflict of interest and put the interests of the organization ahead of your own personal or professional interests. And so that's duty of loyalty. And then finally, duty of obedience is complying with all the applicable federal, state, local laws, adhering to your own bylaws, and remaining the guardians of the mission. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. This is an easy Google search if you want to know more about duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience. So one of the distinctions that I think it's really important to make, and I found to be really helpful, is recognizing that as a board member, you have a dual role. You have the things that the board does, those three umbrellas that only the board can do collectively as a group to provide governance to the organization. But we also have the role as individual board members when we bring our unique skills and talents and relationships to the organization, and we bring those in a support role. So I think of governance maybe a little top down and support as bottom up. But really I also can think of them as hats, right? It's when we're wearing our governance hat collectively in quorum as the board to make policy decisions, versus when we are a volunteer, working in the pantry, working in the garden, out in the community, providing expertise because you happen to be an accountant or you happen to be a nutritionist. And then the third hat is this ambassador role, right? Being an active ambassador in the community, using every possible interaction within your sphere of influence to elevate the community's awareness of and appreciation for your nonprofit organization. So I think particularly for small organizations, when you find yourselves wearing multiple hats, is to recognize, when am I in a governance role? When am I in a support role? And when am I perhaps in this like advocacy role out in the community? So again, the board as a whole sets organizational direction, ensures the necessary resources and provides oversight, and individual board members are responsible for those legal duties, duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience, and being ambassadors and volunteers and providing your own unique individual expertise to the board. All right, I hope that's helpful. That was kind of an aha moment for me 20 years ago when I was on the board of Big Brothers Big Sisters, and I was also a big sister. But when I was a big sister, I was not a board member, right? I didn't have extra authority or power. I couldn't change the rules when I was in that support or volunteer role. I could only do that when I had on my governance hat and was with my fellow board members. So here are things that I share with folks about what you can do to be a great board member, and whether you're taking this in for yourself or what you communicate to potential board members as they join your board. Great board members understand the expectations before they make the commitment, right? They know when the board's going to meet. They know that that works for their schedule. They understand that it's going to be a time commitment and what that's going to mean for them. They understand that at some point they may need to take on a leadership role. They're going to be prepared to do that. A good board member, a great board member, is not afraid to ask questions and challenge the status quo. One of the biggest signs of dysfunction that we observe is boards that are always in agreement. So you want to have respectful disagreement. You want to be able to challenge each other respectfully in the boardroom, but then speak with one voice outside of that boardroom. This is something I'm a real stickler about, is really great board members come to all the meetings. It's really hard to be a great board member. If your board only meets once a month or every other month, and you miss 2 or 3 of those meetings, it's really hard to fulfill those responsibilities of duty of care, duty of obedience. It's really hard to not slow down the progress of your fellow board members if you are questioning decisions that were made 3 meetings ago and you weren't there. So it's something that I think we tend to not emphasize enough when we ask people to join our board, because we're afraid they're going to say no. But I'd rather somebody consciously say there's no way I'm going to be able to make 7 a.m. meetings on a Wednesday than agree to join your board and never show up. So yeah, there you go. Coming to meetings prepared, and we'll talk a little bit about the importance of preparing for meetings in advance so that you can make good use of people's time. Sending out materials in advance, an agenda, the financial report, committee reports perhaps, so that folks come to meetings ready to work together to create solutions instead of just looking backwards and answering questions about what's already happened. Taking on leadership roles when asked, we talked about that. Enlisting others who share values. I feel like one of the best things you do as board members is constantly scanning the environment for people that you think are going to be drawn to the mission of your organization, that are going to care about what you're doing in the community and might want to be a volunteer, might want to be a donor, might potentially be a good board member, or might just be a great subject matter expert that you can turn to from time to time. So we're always scanning, we're always looking for those connections. But at the end of the day, and I think any director would agree, the very best board members just do what they say they're going to do. And if they can't do something, they're honest with themselves and with you beforehand, right? But if you make a commitment, that you follow through with it. So the challenges that we see most frequently within boards is a poor understanding of roles, which then, people are disappointed, there's hurt feelings, there's power struggles. So being really clear up front about what's the role of the staff and what's the role of the board. Either micromanagement or neglect, right? They're 2 extremes that can create problems. Lack of a partnership mindset, either the board seeing itself as the authority, that we're here to direct the director, instead of saying we're here to partner with the director. Spending time on the wrong things, which is often what happens in unproductive meetings, right? We spend a whole lot of time talking about, where we're going to put the parking cones instead of, what are the key relationships we need to make in this community over the next 2 to 3 years in order to make sure that every family that needs our support gets it, right? Those are the kind of strategic or high-level conversations we want boards to be having. So having well thought out agendas that focus the most amount of time on the most important issues instead of a lot of wasted time that we end up seeing in board meetings. Uneven participation and engagement, 1 or 2 people taking to control the entire thing and everybody else sits quietly. That's a challenge for a lot of boards. And then again, I think one of the biggest issues that we see is lack of candor, right? Is people who are afraid to speak up and say what they're really thinking, and then we end up in the parking lot after the meeting in pairs, complaining about what didn't go the way we wanted it to go. So being a board member requires a lot of courage and candor to speak up and be okay with being challenged and perhaps, not getting your way all the time, but at least agreeing to a good, respectful discussion or debate. And when you do have a paid staff member and director, we think one of the solution that solves most of these issues is having a really healthy, positive, powerful partnership between the staff leader, executive director, or CEO, whatever you call them, and the board, right? Really understanding the unique roles that each person or group plays in providing leadership to the organization. And both are providing leadership, right? The staff is providing, the executive director is providing management leadership, the board is providing governance leadership, and together you create that really powerful partnership. All right, I've just got a couple more slides left, and then we'll be able to dive into questions that you might have. So be thinking of what those are. So here's just a few tips for productive board meetings. And actually, as I'm reading them, I realize that probably the most important one is left off of this, and that's preparation, right? Is going into a meeting with an agenda, with a clear idea of why you're meeting, what you want to accomplish during that meeting, how you're going to allocate your time for that meeting. If you find that your board meetings are running longer than an hour and a half, you've got a problem, right? That means you're not effectively preparing and creating a thoughtful agenda. And so we spend a lot of time just sort of meandering around. So sometimes I think the rule of thumb is, you probably are spending 2 to 3 hours preparing for every hour of meeting time that you're going to have, making sure you've got the right advanced materials for people to read, that you have gathered information to answer people's questions, that you know what kind of action the board is, is this just for their learning and understanding, or does the board need to make some kind of decision? Being really, really clear. So that would be my number one. Number two is good facilitation. And that's the job of the board chair. The job of the board chair is not necessarily the person that knows the most about the organization and is willing to, weigh in on and make all the decisions. A really good board chair is just a good facilitator, knows how to run a good meeting, knows how to make sure that everybody in the meeting has an opportunity to speak up and be heard, and actually does very little talking, right? A good facilitator is making sure that all of the voices in the room are being heard. Productive meetings have a good set of ground rules. Sometimes that might be informed by things like Robert's Rules of Order, though I don't necessarily believe that we all have to follow Robert's Rules of Order, but we do need to have some shared understanding of how decisions are going to be made, what we expect from each other in terms of communication and respect, that when we make a decision, we're going to act on that. We're not going to keep second guessing it meeting after meeting, those kinds of things. If we can establish good ground rules up front, then again, it's just like expectations. Then everybody has a clear understanding. Equitable participation, again, making sure that 1 or 2 voices aren't dominating the conversation and the direction of the organization. And then these last 4 things are actual specific tools that I would recommend or use. The first is something we call a mission moment. And we found it can be very powerful to begin your board meeting by really grounding yourself in an example of why you exist as an organization. So this could be reading a thank you letter that maybe you've received from a community member, or hearing from somebody who has benefited from your program, or a volunteer coming in and sharing a story of an interaction they had with somebody in the community, or a food provider coming in and talking about why it matters to them that that they're able to send their day-old bread, and whatever it is, but something that helps feed the soul a little bit and remind you of why you're there and what your ultimate purpose is before you start digging into things like bylaws and financials and policy, right? That's not the fun stuff, but that's the job of the board. So take 5 minutes, 10 minutes at the beginning of every board meeting and share a story or 2 that help people really connect deeply with your mission. Another tool we recommend is something called the consent agenda, which is taking a bunch of items that really don't require discussion and putting them together for the board to approve at one time. So this might include things like an executive director's report, the minutes from the last meeting, committee reports, sometimes even your financials, as long as your financials, don't have anything that requires the board to discuss or pay attention to. And when you can take all of those things, put them into one consent agenda, get one motion, approve those items, then you don't spend 15 minutes, proofreading and editing minutes from your previous meeting. I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but I've sat in more than one board meeting where we have corrected the punctuation of board meeting minutes for 15 minutes, and I want to put a poker in my eye. So consent agenda helps make your meeting more efficient and ensures that you have more time to focus on the issues that really matter, that require the board to have conversation around. I'm going to skip to number 7 because we call that a strategic agenda, is actually planning out, we're going to have 5 minutes for this, 3 minutes for this, and then we're going to spend 25 minutes talking about volunteer recruitment strategies. Because of COVID, we've lost volunteers, we really need to ramp up our volunteer recruitment efforts. We're struggling. Let's spend 20 minutes together as a board, brainstorming ideas, and see if we can come up with some good solutions for whatever this strategic question is. So the strategic agenda really focuses around maybe one pressing issue that the board can do some problem solving around, and then really minimizing some of the just sort of obligatory, approval of the minutes and that kind of stuff. And then finally, the last tool is something we call a dashboard. And this is a 1-page report usually that is monitoring all of the key performance indicators for your organization. So if you think of the dashboard of your car, you've got fuel indicator, your speed indicator, your RPMs, your heat, and you're watching those gauges to know whether your car's going to keep running, right? Same thing with nonprofits. We want to know how many people have we served? How many new people have we enrolled? How many pounds of food did we distribute? How many pounds of food wasted because it expired before we were able to get it out? How much cash do we have in the bank? Or how many days or weeks or months of operating cash do we have, right? So there are some programmatic, there's some financial, there may be even indicators around governance. How many board members do we have relative to how many we want? What's our board meeting attendance been? 80%, 85%, 50%, right? So a dashboard usually takes all of these metrics, maybe there's 12 or 15 of them total. And that's what the board is looking at to monitor the health of the organization. And when one of those things is out of whack, your RPMs are running high, your fuel level is low, the gauge is really close to the overheating thing, then the board says, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on with that? Let's focus on that, right? So that's the purpose of the dashboard. So as we kind of wrap up, we've got about 8 minutes here for your questions, but I'd like for you to be thinking about what might your board need or want to do differently. Maybe was there an idea that came forward here today that you might want to write down a couple of things to take back to your board and say, hey, I learned about this mission moment, or hey, I think we really need a board member job description. And then what personal commitments are you willing to make in terms of your board leadership? Maybe I think each one of you has the opportunity to be a change agent, to take something that you've learned and bring it back to help strengthen the performance of your board. Or maybe you have to really reflect on your own participation. Chances are if you're here, you're probably pretty engaged, but sometimes this is the aha moment. You were like, oh, well, I thought, you know, just having my name on the letterhead was enough, but maybe I really should start coming to meetings more consistently. Maybe there's something personally that you want to try to do, or a commitment that you want to make to yourself and to your nonprofit. So that is the information I prepared to share with you today. Here's my email information. If you do need to get in touch, want to get in touch with me if you have any follow-up questions. I'll share with you, and I think Terry may have attended this on Monday, right? Yeah. So once a month, we do offer a board service orientation. It covers a lot of the information that we covered today, and some other information as well. It's an hour and a half. And it's something we just make available to the community. We do it by Zoom. So perhaps if you have other board members that weren't able to be here today and you think they might benefit from hearing this information, it's something you can just go right to our website, sign up for, and we do it every month.